get the show on the road. In 1981, I joined the San Francisco Police Department. And for the 5 months that I was in the police academy, one of the lessons that I was taught was how to make traffic stops. Traffic stops were predicated on seeing either moving violations or equipment violations, how to make a safe traffic stop, approach the vehicle, and what to ask the person. In 1981, the only two questions we asked were for driver's license and proof of registration. That was the sum total of what we did back then. 7 years later, I was transferred to the narcotics unit. One of the very first things I was taught in the narcotics unit was how to use a traffic stop to interrogate, interview, investigate any suspected activity, especially as it pertained to narcotics use, possession, or transportation. Traffic stops under those conditions were used. The questions went way beyond driver's license and registration, where we began asking people where they were coming from, where they were going to, if they had any weapons or contraband, other drugs on them, and anything to try to basically intrude on the person's free passage under the pretense of making a traffic stop. At that time, we found this was a very valuable tool for doing exactly that, detaining people and conducting searches and investigations without anything further, without having a warrant, without any real other substantial justification. This was in contrast to what I had been taught as a rookie in the police academy. So that being said, I want to introduce myself. My name is Carl TENNENBAUM. I was a San Francisco police officer for 32 years. And on behalf of CLEAN, Community Law Enforcement Accountability Now of Sonoma County, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar. CLEAN is a nonprofit 501c3 organization whose primary goal is to foster better relations with law enforcement in Sonoma County through education and outreach and interacting with the sheriff's office to provide better, more sensitive, and more humane law enforcement. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce two panelists who have agreed to be here. And as I told them before we started this Zoom meeting, I am absolutely floored that both of them were available and willing to come here to speak to you tonight. Joining us tonight are Senator Stephen Bradford. Hold on a second, I am so sorry. California State Senator Stephen Bradford and San Francisco Police Commission Vice President Max Carter OBERSTONE. Senator Bradford, a lifelong resident of Gardena, has over 2 decades of public service, serving as Gardena City Council member, a state assembly member, and since 2017, as a state senator. In 2020, Senator Bradford was named chair of the Senate Committee on Public Safety, where he authored legislation to increase law enforcement transparency and accountability. In addition to SB 50, Senator Bradford authored SB 2, arguably the most significant police reform bill in California in the last decade. SB 2 created the first statewide process to allow for the decertification of police officers who abuse the public trust and commit serious acts of misconduct. Commissioner Carter OBERSTONE is a native San Franciscan, just like myself, who was appointed to the San Francisco Police Commission by Mayor London Breed in November 2021. An Orrick Justice Fellow at the Policing Project at NYU Law School, Commissioner Carter OBERSTONE drafted model legislation on a range of policing-related topics and designed and implemented the Policing Project's Fourth Amendment impact litigation strategies. In May 2022, Commissioner Carter OBERSTONE published a draft policy for ending pretext stops and ban a few specific traffic stops in San Francisco, which was ultimately passed by the commission, the Police Commission. And again, I cannot thank both of these gentlemen for being here and for the amazing legislation that they've done. I would like to offer Senator Bradford an opportunity to introduce himself and give us a background on the legislation that he's enacted. You're muted, Senator.
Sorry. All right, great. Thank you, Mr. Tannenbaum, and I appreciate the invitation to join you this evening. CLEAN, Community for Law Enforcement Accountability Now, which is critically important, and also our police commissioner for being here today and to talk briefly about pretextual stops and my bill, SB 50, that looks to eliminate pretextual stops here in the state of California. As stated, San Francisco has implemented similar policies like this, and they've already seen the benefits of reducing those citizen and police interactions, which is critically important, and that's what we're trying to do with this measure, SB 50, to build greater public trust, but also free up law enforcement's hands to do the jobs that they really need to do, and that's combating crime and going after the criminal element. I think this measure will make the community as a whole safer. It's a common sense approach to say that officers cannot stop you simply because your tail light's not working or your registration is less than 6 months expired, or you have something hanging over your rearview mirror. History has shown us what happens many times, especially in communities of color, with stops like this. We all know about Dante Wright, Philando Castile, Walter Scott, Sandra Bland, and Tyree Nichols just of late. And we know it didn't end well for any of those. All of them lost their lives simply for basic pretextual stops. So what we're trying to do in California is eliminate that unnecessary interaction, because we know data shows very rarely does it lead to arrest or even a citation. It leads to harassment, and it creates a greater divide and fear in the community. So I'm excited to talk about SB 50 and pretextual stops, and look forward to the discussion this evening.
Max, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Carl, for the invitation, and thank you to Clean for hosting this. And I'm delighted to join Senator Bradford for this conversation. I think one of the reasons I was so interested in starting with pretext stops as the first policy I worked on the commission is just that vehicle and pedestrian stops are by far the most common way that people interact with the police. And so if you can get those interactions right, it'll go a long way towards improving community relationships with law enforcement, and also prevent a lot of the negative downstream effects that can happen when stops go wrong, which the senator alluded to. I think there's two key reasons to take on a policy like this. The first is just that we have to be intelligent, especially at a time in San Francisco where we have low police staffing numbers. We have to be intelligent about how we marshal our scarce law enforcement resources. The regime of pretext stops, we have decades of data on it. It has been an absolute failure in terms of stopping or preventing crime. These low-level stops result in arrests and discovery of contraband at a fraction of a percent of the time. And all of the time and money and resources that are wasted on this could be rerouted to other law enforcement strategies that are proven to actually make us safer. The second is that, in jurisdictions all across the country, but certainly in San Francisco, there are enormous race disparities in terms of who is stopped for these low-level infractions. In San Francisco, Black people are 10 times more likely to be stopped for an equipment violation, despite not committing these violations at a higher rate than their, similarly situated white peers. And we have a moral and constitutional obligation to treat every person equally under the law, regardless of background. And this policy is one important way that we can vindicate that idea and carry out that responsibility.
Thank you both for that. I wanted to, I actually neglected to tell the audience that, the purpose of this webinar is to explain what a pretext stop, because a lot of people really don't understand what that is. And when I talked about my history, learning how to make a basic traffic stop, and then 6 years later as a narcotics officer doing a pretext stop, and basically, it's a pretext or a pretense to detain somebody and to dig a lot deeper than your normal traffic stop. And these involve lengthy detentions of people that go on beyond a reasonable time limit. And also to understand the negative impact, as you alluded to, Max and Senator, the negative impact that it has on the community as a whole, but primarily or specifically statistically against communities of color. And I can verify, as somebody who made a lot of pretext stops as a narcotics officer, we were sent into areas and directed to stop people that were from the communities of color. And that's a very unfortunate reality that it took me a long time to realize was not a good thing. On that note, I want to ask, well, I have the definition. What legal precedents, and this is for Max, what legal precedents or guidelines currently exist regarding pretext stops, and how do they vary across different jurisdictions? And I guess what I want to know is, when did pretext stops become accepted or legal for police to do?
Well, the U.S. Supreme Court in a case called Wren, which I think was published, I could be off, I think it was published in the late 80s, basically gave its blessing to pretext stops. And after that, after the Supreme Court spoke on that issue, there was no longer any Fourth Amendment barrier to conducting pretext stops. Since that time, we've seen decisions in courts all across the country, including by conservative judges, that have called Wren into question, given all of the data that has been collected since the decision was handed down. But in terms of what the legal landscape is today in 2024, I think you've got a couple dozen jurisdictions that have implemented some form of regulation of pretext stops. And again, there's political diversity in terms of the jurisdictions that have taken it on. So there's blue cities like Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, but you also have places like the Commonwealth of Virginia and Nashville and Fayetteville, North Carolina, that have all decided to regulate pretext stops. I think the most important thing to take away is that everywhere, every jurisdiction that has done this it has been an unmitigated success. You haven't seen crime go up, but you have seen officers just simply focusing on other strategies that are more effective at preventing and stopping crime. And one anecdote that the chief of Fayetteville mentioned was that and he used the resources that were available to him from stopping or from de-emphasizing these low-level stops. He used those resources to create a task force with the federal government to focus on high-level drug dealers, and was able to make some really high-profile arrests that took several months and in some cases years of investigation to carry out, where he simply wouldn't have been able to do that if his officers were making traffic stops at the rate that they had been.
I think that's an important point. And, I talked a minute ago about the unreasonable detentions of people, but as you both alluded to, the resources being used by law enforcement to do these pretext stops. And I can also confirm that the vast majority of them, great majority of them, do not ever yield. Officers use these to do these intrusive searches, and they really usually it turns up nothing. And that's the reality. So you've spent a lot of time detained a person, and you've used these resources without there's nothing that comes of it. So it's a very good point. My next question, you touched on this a little bit. What evidence exists to suggest that pretext stops are disproportionately used against certain demographics, such as racial or ethnic minorities? And what data research supports the effectiveness of limiting pretext stops and reducing discrimination?
Oh, is that also for me?
It's open. It's either one of you.
Well, we've looked at the Ripper report as it relates to that data. NAACP has provided a tremendous amount of data in this area, as well as law enforcement itself. And it clearly speaks, as he stated, African Americans are 10 times more likely to be stopped for these pretextual stops than their white counterparts. Yet and still, again, as we stated, very rarely does it yield drugs or weapons or a citation. It's harassment. The data also shows that law enforcement dedicates over 80,000 hours annually on these pretextual stops. Imagine what they could be doing with that time. Going after real criminals, speeders, drug dealers, smash and grab that folks are concerned about. We hear from constituents all over the state that want reduce crime, but I've yet to hear anyone talk about, I'm worried about a non-working tail light or someone with air freshener hanging over a rear view mirror. So the data speaks for it. And I like to quote the great philosopher Jay-Z: men lie, women lie, but numbers don't. The numbers are loud and clear again. And even when you talk about stopping cyclists in Los Angeles, 70% of those stops, bicycle stops by the LA sheriffs are Latinos. And again, very rarely is they're found with a weapon on them, drugs, any of that stuff. They don't have a warrant, outstanding warrant. So this is harassment at its best. And it's similar to, what we saw with Stop, Question, and Frisk in New York. And the 8 years of that program existed, and it was deemed later to be unconstitutional. This very much so is along the same lines of just, unjustified stops and harassment on a, search for hopefully catching someone, so running down a rabbit hole, so to speak.
I think we've all kind of avoided using the term fishing expedition because I think it does a disservice to fishermen, but that's what it is. And I think that's the reality. And again, having been there, that was the goal, is like to just root around and dig through every nook and cranny looking for something to no avail. Senator, you mentioned
can I just add one thing to the
Sure.
senator's answer, which is that 80,000 hour figure he cited comes from a PPIC report, which was very thorough, looked at the top 16 law enforcement agencies in California. But that number was very conservative and could actually be 5 or 6 times higher, depending on how you actually define pretext stop. And just one other thing to get at the second piece of your question, Carl, about data on outcomes, when pretext stops are de-emphasized. There's a great study out of Nashville that was done by both the Policing Project and the Stanford Quantitative and Computational Lab. Nashville used to have a very aggressive pretext stop policy, and after they decided to, as they were ending it, they invited Stanford in to collect data, and they actually collected data, crime data, on a block by block basis, crime and stop data. So you can actually see block by block how crime changed when there were a lot of stops versus fewer stops for these low-level infractions. And even as stops just drastically reduced, you didn't see any correlation between crime and pretextual traffic stops in the city. So I think that's a great study that I would encourage folks to take note of.
Thanks, Max. And I think it's a couple of things that are really important to note here that, in San Francisco, and it was my experience that the officers doing pretext stops, as I said, that I learned as a narcotics officer, they're usually the more aggressive cops. They're usually the cops that are on specialized units that really want to dig deep. But there are, as you said, there are agencies that they have policies that encourage that type of behavior. And the other key point that's really important to remember is all the numbers and all the data, that points to discriminatory stuff. Going back to what the senator said, we know of too many people that have lost their lives or been very seriously injured or falsely incarcerated behind a pretext stop. So thank you for that. My next question for both of you, and this is a big one, is what inspired you to take on this challenge, and do you have any personal experience of having been stopped by the police and subjected to some sort of a search?
Again, what inspired me to move forward with this was the data in and of itself. But yes, I personally have a story of pretextual stops. I've told it many times, and it's happened just as recently as the last 3 years. I was leaving a friend's house around 1 a.m. in the morning, and I know I had a shortage in my left front headlight. And so I was pulled over, and the officer says, "Are you aware that your headlight is not working?" I said, "Yeah, it's a little short." I said, "I can tap on it and it might come back on." I says, "But it's a short." Okay. That's why he said he stopped me. Less than a minute later, I'm asked to get out the car, and I'm being subjected to a field sobriety test. At no time did he say I was weaving, I was speeding, driving recklessly. He says he stopped me for a headlight. How did a headlight lead to a field sobriety test? And I can assure you, had I probably been anything other than African American, I wouldn't have been asked to leave my car at 1 a.m. in the morning along a highway and perform a field sobriety test. So that showed me the glaring difference. But again, I've had friends and family that are in law enforcement that have shared these stories as well. And again, all the recent reports, again, just as recently as this year with Tyree Nichols, and on and on and on, of folks who have simply lost their lives because of a simple traffic stop. So that was the real motivation for me, but also my real life lived experience.
Yeah, for me, it's very similar. I think of myself as a data person and an evidence person, and don't want to make policy for a whole city based on, my own kind of experiences as a single person. But that said, we don't leave our experiences at the door. When we do our jobs, they're part of who we are. And I did have, personally, many pretext stops carried out against members of my family. One I would call out that I personally experienced is I was driving with my friend who's also Black. We were pulled over on the highway for allegedly going a couple miles an hour over the speed limit. We were both pulled out of the car. We were both had a pat search done on us. The officer had one hand on his service weapon and the other hand patting me down. It was a very tense moment. By the end of it, there were 3 or 4 squad cars at the scene. They called the K9 unit to do a sniff search of the car. We were on the side of the road for what felt like a really, really long time. And before we left, the officer told us that he could, quote, take us boys to jail if he wanted to, but he was going to let us go this time with a warning. So, there's a lot of fear, and there's just a sense of powerlessness and a sense of indignity and a sense that you're being singled out for disfavored treatment because of your race. And things like that just fundamentally shape how you conceive of yourself and conceive of, your place in society. So, even when something truly tragic doesn't take place, it can still have important effects for how people see themselves in terms of just part of society and part of the body politic.
Thank you, Max. Thank you, Senator. Max, I have a question for you. It wasn't on the list of questions, but I think it's very interesting. It's like people needing to understand the difference between a pretext stop and a regular stop. You're very well versed in the Fourth Amendment, and a lot of people don't understand what a taking is, or when a traffic stop. I talk about detentions, and we sort of accept it as business as usual, that you get pulled over and you get stopped. Well, that's a detention, and that is encroaching on the Fourth Amendment. Could you talk about that a little bit, please?
Sure. I mean, I won't do a Fourth Amendment kind of discourse, and it would be great for listeners who have medically incurable insomnia, but for the rest of us, I wouldn't subject you to that. I mean, I guess the important thing to know is to make a stop under the Constitution, you have to have what's called reasonable suspicion. And really all that means is you need to have some type of concrete facts, some type of reason that you think this person is engaged in criminal activity or has evidence of a crime. It can't just be a hunch or a gut feeling or some instinctual feeling that resides in you. What happens in a pretext stop is that the officer just doesn't have reasonable suspicion that someone's engaged in a crime. They have this hunch. Maybe the person just looks like they don't belong in the neighborhood. They look like they're up to no good, but the Constitution doesn't let you stop someone for that. So instead but what they do have reasonable suspicion of is a minor vehicle code infraction. And because our vehicle codes are so bloated with thousands and sometimes even tens of thousands of infractions, it's almost impossible for anyone to drive for any amount of time without without committing some technical violation. And so the officer uses reasonable suspicion of one of these low-level infractions as a way to make a stop. And then once they're stopped, they can question them about what the officer is truly interested in, which is their potential criminal involvement in having nothing to do with the traffic code. They can ask them for consent to search their car, since the Constitution would let them effect a search, but if the person gives them consent, they can do it. And most people who aren't constitutional scholars, don't know that you're free. If an officer asks you, can I search your car? You're free to just say no. It's a coercive situation where the person there is going to ultimately decide if you get a ticket or not. And they're a person of authority. And so I think a lot of people feel like they don't have a legitimate choice. So that's kind of how pretext stops fit into the kind of general constitutional standards for making stops.
Thanks, Max. I appreciate using the word coercive, because that's what it is. It's a lot of pressure and threats to people when they're faced with an armed agent of the state. The next question I have for both of you is, what has been the challenges of getting this legislation either started or passed from law enforcement? Are there potential downfalls to, or can we have problems if law enforcement is not allowed to do a pretext stop? What are the consequences, and how is law enforcement responding to these efforts to curtail pretext stops?
Well, I can say from a legislative standpoint, they're full speed ahead trying to kill this bill. They feel it's going to limit their ability. And again, that's the farthest thing from the truth. It's going to free them up to do the real things, to go after those real criminals that we all want. Again, society wants a crime suppression, not community oppression. And what we find, or we get with these pretextual stops, is community oppression. But they have a strong voice in Sacramento, as well as they do throughout the state of California and local government, counties and cities. And they're the biggest voice right now, or the loudest, I should say, in why this bill should move forward. We have to do a better job, I should say, in educating our colleagues and to all the facts. Again, if my colleagues would just look at the data, it clearly justifies why this bill is needed. So that's going to be our challenge, just to get past this climate right now with the smash and grabs and the heightened crime going on across the state and across this nation, that people don't want to be viewed as soft on crime. But again, this, by eliminating pretextual stops, it's going to free law enforcement up to do the real work of going after those criminals. So we just have to educate the public, and we need the public to have their voices heard and letting their legislators know that this is important, and now's the time to pass a measure such as this.
And Max, I know you've faced some heady opposition in San Francisco. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So, I'll say San Francisco has 1,500 or 1,600 sworn officers right now, and they're not a monolith. We spent a lot of time talking to officers when we were drafting this, and there's a real diversity of opinion in terms of people who are strongly opposed to it and people who understand what we're trying to accomplish. I think one of the biggest obstacles we face is that the police commission essentially has no money and no policy staff, and it's really hard to combat some of the misleading narratives that get put out there when you don't have a PR budget. Unfortunately, our police officers union, I think, acted at various points rather irresponsibly in terms of the messaging that they put out for why they were opposing this policy. And members of certain elected officials, including the mayor, a lot of it behind the scenes, did a lot of work to try to kill this policy and try to put a lot of pressure on me personally to delay this policy, and including requiring me to sign an illegal undated letter of resignation that she could accept at any time if I didn't do exactly as I was told. I ultimately rescinded that letter and blew the whistle on the policy, which apparently affected 50 other commissioners, and the city attorney opined that that was illegal and unenforceable. But so there's a lot of kind of soft pressure being put on people outside the public's view, and also misleading public narratives that are just very hard to combat for kind of a volunteer citizen commission.
Thank you. And thank you for having the courage to stand up against the opposition. I know how strong the police unions are and how strong the police, the lobbyists are in Sacramento. And it takes a lot of courage to do what both of you are doing. So I really, really appreciate it. What the question you said, talked about this a little bit, Senator Bradford, what can, the community members, the stakeholders, policymakers, how can they work to further this legislation and legislation like it? And also, what is the current status of SB 50 and how do you see it moving forward?
Okay, well, the current status of SB 50 is it's on the assembly floor. That's where it was stalled last year, late August, early September, when we realized we didn't have 41 votes to move it. So it's still there. We're constantly talking to my colleagues on the assembly to try to get to 41. But I think what the public needs to do is let their legislators know that they want this to pass. They want this to get to the governor's desk and be signed. It's common sense legislation. It makes us all safer. Again, it makes law enforcement safer. It makes the general public safer when we can eliminate these unnecessary interactions. As people will say, many folks don't hate the police, especially in Black and brown communities. We want their presence there all the time. What we do is fear the police, and these pretextual stops is part of that fear that individuals have because they've seen those horrible outcomes that I've mentioned already. So by building greater public trust, it eliminates that fear and makes all of us safer. So they need to, like I say, talk to their legislators, especially on the assembly, to say that this is important and combat the noise that police unions are making in Sacramento, because they have tremendous sway. And, many of these community-based organizations can't afford lobbyists to come to Sacramento and advocate on their behalf. But again, collectively as communities and a voice, we can't do that, but we have to kind of change the narrative too, because people keep talking about this defund the police and things of that nature. This is not what we're talking about. We're talking about, again, just reallocating those resources and allow those officers to go out and really fight crime instead of these unnecessary stops that waste a whole lot of time, as we've all know. And again, they're in many ways applied in a very biased and discriminatory manner. So exposing that as well.
Thank you. And also SB 50 has a couple of other provisions in it that, we focus on the pretext stops, but can you speak to, I believe they're bicycles?
Yeah, it includes the bicycle stops. That was one thing. What we took out was the tenant windows. It also allows this bill allows you to make a pretextual stops if an individual has at least 2 of the violations of the 5 that we're removing. So we're not saying you can't stop them at all, but say if you have a non-working tail light and your headlight's not working, yes, that officer has a right to stop you if this measure passes. But yes, we're dealing with a number of unnecessary stops of individuals on bicycles too. So we removed that. We made that part of what we were moving, that officers couldn't stop you for.
Great. And the other provision, I think I understand it right, is it allows non-sworn personnel to do traffic enforcement, which I think is a real big one.
Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that, and there's some pushback on that, saying, "Oh, we're allowing non-sworn to do law enforcement jobs," but this role would be hardly any different from our parking, officers who cite cars, and many days they have direct interaction with the public when you're writing that ticket. I know I've encountered officers when they're writing the ticket, and we've gotten into dialogue. So I don't think this puts those officers at any greater risk, or the public as whole, but that's some pushback too. But yeah, this would allow it doesn't mandate, but it allows our parking officers to be the ones to issue a citation if, in fact, a violation has occurred.
And would that be, I mean, we already have a lot of jurisdictions are using like red light cameras. And that's not, I mean, I know it goes through the police department, but that's not a police officer enforcing a traffic law. So is that a fair analogy?
That's a good analogy. Yes. I mean, and it's worked in areas where the red light cameras are working. We just passed legislation just last year that goes in effect, that went in effect, I should say, in January, that we have, I think, 4 test areas for speed cameras, you know? So now you would think that's a role that a law enforcement officer should be doing, but now we're going to allow cameras to issue speeding tickets. I mean, not, yeah, speeding tickets. And so just as we had the red light cameras, now you have speeding tickets. So it's ways to eliminate those stops and yeah, and incorporate new technology.
Cool. Max, and when you had changed the policy through the police commission, I noticed you also, there was some legislation that you pushed forward regarding other low-level just traffic stops in general. And I think the question to both of you, because we're making these incremental steps or trying to make these incremental steps, are there any chance, like what were the things that you pushed forward in San Francisco, and any thought of addressing, there are some agencies and jurisdictions that aren't doing any low-level traffic enforcement at all, pretext or otherwise. They just feel that it's not a valuable use of their resources. Can you talk to that, Max?
Sure. Yeah, if I understand the call, well, yeah, let me give a preliminary answer, and then you tell me if it's responsive. Yeah, so San Francisco post-pandemic has seen a sharp decline in overall traffic enforcement, and it hasn't really rebounded since to pre-pandemic levels. I think in many ways that's unfortunate, because we do need more enforcement of the infractions that lead to injuries and deaths and carnage on our roadways. Things like excessive speeding and illegal U-turns and reckless driving and DUI. Making stops for that is critical, and that's actually something we could do more of if we eliminate pretext stops. So yeah, but I'm not sure I quite understood the call of your question, Carl. So
No, I think that kind of answer. I know, like I said, there is a move to just eliminate, let's use the example of the broken tail light. The broken tail light as a premise or a pretext to get, to do a search or a question. But if you're on your way to the doctor, or you're taking your child to soccer practice and you've got a broken tail light, is that something that do we need to enforce little, minor infractions like that, generally speaking?
Oh, I see. I understand what you're saying now. So, our policy in San Francisco is very much about limiting stops. It's not about limiting enforcement. There's a whole other set of concerns around excessive fines and fees. Our policy does not deal with this. It's really laser focused on the stops issue. So our policy allows actually a lot of alternative avenues for enforcement. So now that the state legislature has spoken, as the senator mentioned, we'll be able to have, speed cameras, but that obviously speeding's not de-emphasized in our policy. But for example, we allow enforcement of any infraction on the list of low-level offenses that are being de-emphasized if you're pulled over for something else. So if you're pulled over for speeding and you also have a broken taillight, you can be ticketed for both. Registration tabs is something else that's de-emphasized in our policy. You can't be stopped for it, but if your car is parked and your tags are expired, you can be ticketed for that. So we really, this policy is already an important kind of overhaul of the way we do things. And so we wanted to keep it focused on the issue of stops while still leaving avenues open for enforcement.
Thank you. I don't have any more questions. We have a couple of questions for the audience, and the one that I actually, this would be directed towards Senator Bradford. Somebody asked, our local Sonoma County or this Senator McGuire, Dodd, who Jim Wood and Damon Conley do they have they taken a position on SB 50, or do you know?
Well, we got it out of the Senate, so
Okay.
now Pro Tem McGuire has voted for it. I think Senator Dodd voted for it. Now it's on the Assembly side, so we're going to need individuals like Jim Wood to be a advocate and a champion for this. We were about 8 votes short last year when we were ready to take it up, so we just got to re-examine that list and continue talking to folks.
Do you happen to know where Assemblyman Conley stands on it?
Not off the top of my head. No, I don't
Okay.
have that list in front of me.
Cool.
I can get that for you though.
But I would love to have it, because
Okay.
I would love to reach out to him and see where he stands on it. And I'm
Okay.
glad to hear it got out of the Senate.
Yeah.
That's all I have question wise from the audience. Do you have any closing remarks or additional information you'd like to share with us?
I would just add, and we've already stated it, but again, this is a common sense measure that makes society as a whole, both law enforcement and the general public, safer, makes law enforcement far more efficient and user friendly. And it addresses a real problem that exists, regardless of what folks want to believe. There are biases when this is applied. I remember having a hearing a number of years ago, and we had a police chief from Northern California who was testifying about an issue, and someone asked a question, what was the toughest thing he had to do as a police officer? And as tears welled up in his eyes, and this police chief, I failed to mention, happened to be African American. He says, one of the toughest things I had to do is have that talk with my 16-year-old son about not if he'll be stopped, but when he'll be stopped. And that speaks to the fact that we are targeted far more than our counterparts, and it's biases when applying these stops, and we just have to end these. So when you have someone in law enforcement who had a child grow up in a household that knows how to abide by the laws, and they're fearful that their son or daughter will be stopped unnecessarily because of these pretextual stops, I think it speaks why this is important, why is it needed, and the time is right to pass this.
I might offer 2 pieces of advice for specifically local governments that are interested in implementing a pretext policy. I think the first is the importance of public input and feedback throughout the development process. You've seen a lot of different approaches in different jurisdictions. I found that we undertook the most robust public input process in the history, at least the modern history. The commission's been around for about 150 years. The modern history of the San Francisco Police Commission. We held closed door town halls just with patrol officers, without command staff in the room, so we could get candid feedback. Another agency, the Human Rights Commission, was kind enough to host over a dozen community town halls all across San Francisco, held after 5 o'clock, so people could come after work, learn about the policy, give their feedback. All that feedback was compiled in a report. They also had an online survey for the folks who couldn't attend in person the community sessions. We held working groups with the kind of subject matter experts and went over the policy line by line with folks from law enforcement, experts in the legal community, members of other members of the community in the room. Every recommendation we received was public and put online so the public could see. Every letter or email we received was put online in real time so the public could see. And this level of transparency and public input had 2 effects. One, we got some really important feedback that was invaluable in terms of shaping the policy. A lot of feedback from officers who just have experience enforcing our traffic laws, that caught things that a non-law enforcement commission would know. Also, feedback from the community, especially certain kind of minority communities that we may not have gotten their unique experiences, like the disabled community, for example, had thoughts about, scooters and bikes on the sidewalk. And the other thing it did is having so much public outreach helped combat some of the mistruths that were circulating by much more powerful constituencies. So that would be my first piece of advice. The second piece of advice is the senator and I have talked a lot about making a data-driven policy, but to me, what that actually means at the local level is for any infraction that you are going to de-emphasize, you, as much as your data permits it, should be able to say what percentage of stops for that infraction result in an arrest or discovery of contraband, what percentage result in a car crash or an injury or a death. You know, we were able to go out there and say, because we worked with the local transportation agency, nothing on our list has, you know, resulted in a death or injury or crash, you know, zero. That was a powerful point we could make. And the thing, in terms of recovery of guns, it's a fraction of a percent. In terms of arrests, it's a fraction of a percent. And we took things off the list. We took, as the senator did, we took tinted windows off the list because it wasn't a gold mine for contraband, but it was higher than the negligible levels that we saw from the other stops. And there's just no reason to come close to the line in terms of if you're going to de-emphasize something, it should be restricted to those infractions that really have no public safety benefit. So those would be my two main pieces of advice.
As to your first piece of advice, Max, I can't thank you enough for that because I happen to know, I looked at the list of participants. There's one of our local chiefs of police is on this webinar, and he's been very open to working with the community to improve his law enforcement agency's relationship with the community. And I think I'm glad that he's here to hear that, and I know that he would welcome having a community and committee to meet with him and to do that. The other thing, I think it might be important to some of these issues, and again, Max, you talk about the data. I just know that the SB 50 is not a standalone bill as far as these police reforms that we're trying to do, these little, I call incremental steps. It's now, you know, we've legalized jaywalking, correct? And we did that for a very similar reason. And now we've legalized, you know, cruising and lowriders, especially up in this, you know, Sonoma County community. And these are all collectively are very good steps in the right direction. So as I said at the outset, you know, both of you bring such valuable integrity and courage to do what you're doing that it's really, really appreciated. And I hope that everybody listening will, you know, take it to heart, you know, reach out to their assembly people to get this legislation passed. Also, Senator, you mentioned the RIPA data that helped with this legislation. This webinar is our second webinar that Clean has sponsored. We did our most recent one this past October, doing quarterly ones, and that was on RIPA, which ties in directly to what we're talking about now. It really does, because that's where the data comes from. That's where we see a lot of the discriminatory practices. There is a link. We'll include a link to that webinar in the chat box for anybody that wants to go and watch that video. But RIPA is a very, for those that don't know, it's the Racial Identity and Profiling Act, and it's a state law, if I'm not mistaken, Senator, that they have to gather the data. All law enforcement is required to gather the data and to share that, to see what, you know, who's being stopped, when, why, and where. And there's a lot of really telling information that came from the RIPA report.
Yeah, good information there.
So we're way ahead of schedule here, but I don't know if anybody has anything. We've covered it all. I have another question here.
I would just say it's also been a poll, and the general population overwhelmingly wants this type of reform. So to allow the narrative that, you know, the community doesn't support it, no. Overall, I think it was better than 60% of folks that were polled on this issue is in support of banning pretextual stops in all communities. So that needs to be shared.
I appreciate hearing that, and I think that speaks to the common sense legislation that it is, and for all the reasons that we've covered today. Just, you know, to more effectively use our resources, especially when it comes to real crime, to crime that really needs to be addressed. Like Max, you talked about, there are staffing shortages throughout the country with law enforcement, and locally we're seeing that. So we need those officers to focus on the crime at hand and not be tied up doing pretext stops. Well, I can't thank you enough. If there's nothing else, I think we're way ahead of the schedule. So I want to thank everybody for who's attended today. And just remind you to get active, to stay involved, participate. And I want to leave everybody with one last thought, and it's this. You know, Max talked about it was actually 1996, Wren versus the United States, and it was very similar to the work that I was doing as a plainclothes police officer, where these plainclothes officers saw a person coming from a high crime drug area, and it's the same narrative, and they stopped the car. And that's the case law that made legalized pretext stops. It certified it. And my takeaway from that is, you know, the Supreme Court does their best. They don't always get it right. And it's one of those cases where they said it's okay, it's legal to do this. But the old saying that's attributed to a lot of different sources, that just because you have the right to do something doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. And I will leave you with that thought. Again, gentlemen, I cannot thank you enough for participating today.